we're hanging out on a Thursday. It's not noon. It is live, though, just past 6 o'clock on Thursday, June 5th, after Max and I were in State College at the Lash Building, talking to James Franklin and talking to the entire Penn State football staff. They do this once a summer,
That's right.
Really before training camp starts, after spring ball, kind of that dead period, not dead period for them because they're recruiting this weekend, next weekend, the weekend after that, and having official visitors in. But it's a good time to kind of catch up with the staff before Big Ten media days, before the vibes of the season really start to get going, but there's still some post spring stuff to fill in and talk about. And there's plenty to talk about today, Max.
There is.
And so first and foremost, though, how are you doing?
Doing well, Johnny. It's good to have this summer availability. This is always one of my favorite things each year because it offers so much personal time, I guess, with some of the assistant coaches that we don't see a whole lot throughout the year, to be able to just chat with them and get a little more insight on a lot of the guys that, might be flying under the radar right now. But of course, as we talked about before hopping on here, Johnny, today was kind of a really newsy day with some of the stuff going on with Penn State. So let's dig into it.
It was indeed. Yeah. I know we both had the expectation of just, like you mentioned, it's always nice to this time we walked from office to office.
Yeah.
Dan Connor's hanging out in the linebackers room. Phil Troutwine's hanging out in the offensive line room. And you just walk into each room and talk to whoever you want to talk to for, a half hour. And we were able to split up our time really, really well. Talk to all those guys and have a lot of really good stuff coming over the next few days and even weeks as we, parse through all of this and get everything going. But to start us off, before we talk to the assistant coaches, we sat with James Franklin as a media contingent with him for about, 15, 20 minutes or so in the Penn State team room at the Lash Building. And it was pretty news-centric. The biggest piece of news, an unfortunate piece of news, Max Granville, second-year defensive end, a guy who both of us thought was going to have a really big role for this team this year. Whether or not he was going to start opposite Deni Dennis Sutton, he felt like he could be in that starter level, third starter, like James Franklin likes to say, role for this team as a redshirt freshman in 2025. That doesn't seem like it's going to happen. He's dealing with a long-term injury that he suffered over the break in between the end of spring camp and now when players have now come back to campus for their own individual workouts. That's all the details we got from James Franklin. It happened when he was working out, basically at home over break. And it is a really rough break for this Penn State defense that, already lost Abdul Carter. Amin Vanover loses the NCAA waiver. Smith Vilbert enters the portal. But also just personally, you have this young player who, enrolled, or, not only enrolled early, he reclassified from the 2020, from his recruiting class to come in early last year and kind of carved out a role for himself as the season went on. And we thought that Max Granville was going to be a big piece of this team. And that was going to be a big stepping stone for him in his own development, into becoming one of the next great defensive ends that come out of Penn State. And, this is a pretty significant setback.
Yeah, it is. It's like you said, it's a really tough break all around. I feel like it's almost like it hurts even worse to know that it happened while he was at home, like away from the facility. I don't know why, but in my brain, that feels like it's just even worse luck and probably feels bad. Like, it's not something that happened on the field or anything like that. But yeah, it's a guy who has a ton of talent. He can really get after the passer. He has a really bright future at Penn State, assuming he comes back from this fully healthy. But of course, a long-term injury, as we've become accustomed to, means most likely season ending. I will say, Penn State could play into the end of January. I guess miracles happen, but you can bank on not seeing Max Granville this year. And it's a real shame for, like you said, for him, but for Penn State as a team, this team that has national championship aspirations, like we keep talking about, it has some question marks on the defensive line and now specifically at defensive end, because we've been talking all offseason about how this was a position group that had talent, had names that had to step up and prove it. And now one of the guys who we thought was going to do that isn't there. So, James Franklin put it best. Like, Max Granville is a young guy, but he was going to play for us. And now because we lost him, it's an even younger group right now. I mean, we're probably going to see some freshmen who are on the field a lot this fall. We're probably going to see some of those redshirt freshmen like Granville, who maybe weren't going to play as much. You think of the Malachi Williams, the Jalen Harvey. They're really high on Harvey. Malachi Williams, we haven't heard as much about, but those two guys are going to have to contribute this year. And White out of the portal. There are still names there, but one of the big ones is gone. And this pretty immediately becomes maybe the biggest question mark on Penn State's roster right now. And I think, like, I mean, if you look down at it, we said, a couple of podcasts ago, like, there's a reason why this team could or should be number one in the nation heading into the season. If you're going to pick a question mark, it's probably at defensive end right now, because there's just not a lot of returning production outside of Dennis Sutton.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're 100% right. You can look at Zuriah Fisher, and we'll get to him in a second, because James Franklin had a lot of really nice things to say about him.
Yeah.
And that's really important, I think, around this Max Granville conversation. Something that Penn State fans can also kind of take solace in, I guess, is, you got Jim Knowles as your defensive coordinator, one of the best play callers in the country, still an uber athletic secondary. And I think, the staff is thinking big things are ahead for Tony Rojas, and you have Amare Campbell, coming in from North Carolina, in terms of creating havoc, in terms of getting after the quarterback, in terms of applying pressure. I think that they'll still be okay in that territory, but still, Max Granville was supposed to have a big role for this team. I mean, James Franklin said it. He said that, this is not what we wanted or needed, and that they were depending on him taking that next step. And when he says something like that, I don't think, like, he obviously feels bad for Max Granville when he's talking about him, but I don't think he's blowing smoke either. Like, there was an expectation for him to be a big part of this defense, of this rotation, and now you don't have him in there. The first couple names that came out of his mouth when talking about guys who would have to step up, obviously Dennis Sutton, and then Zuriah Fisher, the 6-year senior. The next two names after that, it was interesting to me. It was Mason Robinson and Jalen Harvey. And then he just started rattling off, and he's looking at a list. It's Malachi Williams. It's Nittany White, the transfer from Texas A&M, who didn't hear much about during spring camp, even though he was on campus. Yeah. And Kemaju, the true freshman. So, and I know that they just got Daniel Jennings in as a reclassification. They've got a couple more freshmen coming in, Chaz Coleman, one of them. So there's a lot of the bodies, like you mentioned, Max, in Deion Barnes's room. But this is a tough loss, and you were able to talk to Deion Barnes. We split up the assistant coaches. It's a 2-man show here up in State College today. Bob on PTO, and so we're like, let's split these up. Let's cover as much ground as we can. And you talked to Deion Barnes. I'm sure the topic of Max Granville came up.
Yeah, I made a bit of a beeline for Deion immediately after we were done with James. I think his perspective was really interesting for everything that we got on the topic of Granville and of this group moving forward. But I do think I give him a lot of credit for what he said first when we talked about Granville with him. He said, like, man, this just really sucks for Max, because he's a 19-year-old kid who is dealing with a serious injury that is keeping him from playing the game he loves right now. Deion Barnes has played the game. He's been through a lot himself too. So he knows a lot of what Max is going through. And I think that, that's part of the reason why James Franklin hired Deion Barnes before, because he's a young guy who's played at Penn State and been through it. So I think that, I think Deion's I think Deion has a really great relationship with his players. And I think he certainly got the right priority with Granville, and, focusing on his well-being as just a human being right now, aside from football. But beyond that, he was almost I don't know if defensive is the right word, but it was kind of the sense I got from him when we were talking about some of the other names that are coming to play, and the fact that the defensive tackle room as well lost so much experience from last year. He was kind of like, look, I don't know who it is right now, because I need to figure out which guys I trust. They have to do it on the field when we get to fall camp. But every time he said that, he ended the sentence by saying, but we're going to be really good. There are going to be guys out there. And he said it with the type of confidence that I would not just look past. Like sometimes you can think it's coach speak, and like it might be a lot of times. I really did get the sense that Deion Barnes is very confident in his defensive line group right now, both at end and at defensive tackle, despite losing Max Granville and, 2.5 starters if you count Hakeem Beamon from the interior last year. So, it was an illuminating conversation. We'll have more. I'll have more from him, up on Penn Live tomorrow and throughout the next week or so. But I did get the sense that there's some confidence in that room right now.
Yeah, and in terms of confidence and in terms of what inspires that, it does help having an anchor at defensive end like Dennis Sutton, who, is projected right now. And I know we're sitting here in June, and even when way too early, mock drafts came out literally minutes after the 2025 NFL draft came out.
Yeah.
But Denai is looked at as a first round type of talent. He certainly showed that last year down the stretch after, recovered from the in-season injury that he had to put on the show that he did, in the CFP, and more specifically the CFP semifinal, against Notre Dame. I mean, the guy's an absolute freak. Yeah. And, he is a guy that Penn State's defense can lean on, and Penn State's pass rush and defensive line more specifically can rely on. Opposite him, I do think James Franklin and the staff, they're confident that they can rely on Zariah Fisher.
Yeah.
And this is a guy who, we know has been around the building, has been, putting in good work, especially on the mental side of it, when dealing with these injuries that he's had, missing last season, missing, 2 seasons prior to that. It's been a long road for him to get to this point and to have an opportunity that he's had. But, James Franklin, when he was talking about Zariah Fisher, he said there's a lot of excitement internally about him, and he believes he's going to surprise people, across the country, and that he's going to have significant buzz, by mid-season, that he is going to be a guy that not many are talking about even in August. And I know we're going to be talking about him more, especially, I mean, we already were, but especially now with Max out. But I think James Franklin and the staff believe that he's going to have an opportunity and take hold of that opportunity, to show college football, the Big Ten, what he can do. And so, in terms of staying healthy, fingers crossed that Zariah Fisher, after all that he's been through, that he's able to stay healthy, through this summer and then upcoming training camp before the season starts, because, the importance around him just amplified, 2-3-fold.
Yeah, it really did. We got a comment from the live chat saying the depth chart is young in all caps. And I mean, it is like, Zariah and Denai are both, multi-year players. They're very experienced. But beyond that, I mean, like you said, Mason Robinson was the first name that James said. And, he dealt with injuries last year. He's a redshirt sophomore, and he's the most veteran guy they have behind him. I mean, Anai White is older, but he played at Texas A&M, and he was always kind of a project piece to come over here.
And he dealt with injuries there.
That's right.
He showed some flashes, and then he didn't really see the field a whole lot because of those injuries.
Yeah, and like in talking to Deion Barnes, it was kind of the same thing that we've expected with him. Like he came in here and he kind of had to get used to everything, every bit of it, whether it was the film study, the academics, the weight training, the dieting, like everything was kind of an adjustment for him, which is to be expected coming to a new program. But like, we might want to temper our expectations at the start of the season for a guy like Anai White, which, means there are probably going to be freshmen on the field this fall. And I think right now, like Ivan Camacho is the one who, we really have to keep an eye on, because he was around that top line in the blue-white game. He was on the blue team playing with a few of the other first stringers. And basically what Deion said about him was like, the kid just like attacks football. Like he is totally locked in on the mindset. And so I think it's interesting. He's probably the number one right now to see, be in that 4th or 5th spot in the rotation. But they just got Chaz Coleman and Cortez Harris on campus. I think Coleman especially is, maybe on paper, the highest ceiling out of those guys because of the athleticism that he showed. I mean, he was a high school quarterback, could jump out of the gym playing basketball. But, he needs some time to put weight on. like because he was not a defensive lineman in high school. I think that there's certainly some promise there, but is he going to be ready to play right away? Probably not, which then brings us to a guy like Daniel Jennings, who we heard a lot about today, Johnny. The reclassification from the class of 2026 to 2025, he is, maybe a step ahead of some of those other guys. I mean, even a Cortez Harris who dealt with an injury during his senior year of high school, Jennings has good weight on him. He's up above 250 already. I don't believe he's on campus yet, but like once he gets here, he played DN throughout high school. It could be similar to what we saw from Granville down the stretch last year, where he's the primary backup to a guy like Deny in certain packages, or they bring him in just to let him get after the passer a little bit. It's one of those situations where a guy might not fully grasp, an offensive playbook or even the defensive playbook for that matter. But you can say, all right, see ball, get ball. Put him in there to rush the passer on a couple of third downs, and maybe he can make an impact. But it's a really young group, and it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out.
Definitely. It was already going to be interesting, even with Max Granville in the picture, even without that injury. This was always going to be a group that we were going to be watching and keeping a close eye on during August training camp and during those first few games of the season. Nevada, FIU, Villanova, and then bye week, and then you got Oregon and the whiteout, come to Beaver Stadium. And so this group was always going to be under the microscope. Not that it was like, oh my, this is going to be terrible and we have to, right? Like it's just that like we were going to be watching this group very intently. And now that's going to be the case even more so after the Max Granville injury. Some positive injury news coming from James Franklin today. Confirmation that a trio of contributors who missed spring ball, majority of spring ball, will be fully healthy, full go by training camp. And James Franklin said even if you watch them in a workout around the Lash building right now, you probably couldn't tell that anything was wrong with them. And that's linebacker Tony Rojas, right tackle Anthony Donko, and tight end Andrew Rapplier. And it's an important trio. Max. I mean, not that this was a surprise at all that they would be fully healthy. I think it was understood that when they were out for spring ball that they would be back and ready, for the season. And by virtue of that, being ready for training camp, which is just a few weeks before the season, a month before the season. But still big news nonetheless that, that there's confidence that there were no setbacks with those three.
Yeah, absolutely. Andrew Rapplier is the one of the group that I think is most intriguing for me. Just because, I mean, Tony Rojas is going to start and probably be the best linebacker Penn State has this season, assuming he's fully healthy. But Rapplier's role is pretty undefined, I'd say. I mean, Luke Reynolds is expected to take a huge step in his second season. He looked really good at times last year. Khalil Dinkins is kind of always to steal a phrase from James Franklin, he feels like he's that steady Eddie that's always, there for a couple of big catches, good blocking, but he's probably not going to be a superstar in any way. So I think Rapplier, if he really truly is fully healthy, he's posted a few videos on social media. He does look like he's running well and looks okay. If he really is truly healthy, he was going to have a big role last year. And I don't really know where he slots in right now, but you look at that and say, like, this is a tight end room that, lost Tyler Warren, but has three guys who could all start for any team in the country, probably. And it's impressive. Certainly curious to see where Rapp is at. Donko is a big one, of course. I mean, he's the starting right tackle last year. We don't know exactly how that competition is going to shake out because once he went down, Nolan Rucci was damn good last year. He was really good down the stretch. So I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. We're going to have to see it in fall camp and talk to Phil Troutwine a little bit more. I know I think you chatted with him today, Johnny, but the last time I talked with him, he said, it's going to be a true competition. Neither of those guys are promised the spot. And obviously coming off of a big injury, you have to be able to kind of, trust your feet beneath you again for Anthony Donko. So big, good news, but, we'll see how it affects this team.
Yeah, it's a trio of very interesting players for Penn State, very important players for Penn State. Rapp for all the reasons you mentioned. Donko, you mentioned, I was able to talk to Phil Troutwine for a good bit today. And it was interesting. I mentioned we're walking into their position room. So
Yeah.
walking into the offensive line room, and that, of course, all these coaches have their whiteboards and they erased everything because they're not going to let us look at anything that's on the whiteboards. But one thing that was hanging up in the offensive line room was just a poster of the Joe Moore Award, which is given
Mm.
to the best offensive line in college football. And Trout said it's a daily reminder because I truly believe that this group can get there, that this
Yeah.
group can win that award. And typically, it's been given to offensive lines that have led their teams to the CFP or even better,
Mhm.
a national championship. And so Anthony Donko, Nolan Rucci at right tackle, that battle, and the depth that Penn State has on the
Yeah.
offensive line
Yeah.
is a big reason why Trout believes that this group can win that award, can be a driving force and a strength of not only the offense, but of the team. And so that's the big, like, in terms of a question mark, not like it's a concerning question mark like wide receiver has been over the
Mhm.
last couple of years. It's more of a question mark of like literally we don't know like who is going to start at right tackle
Mhm.
because both Donko and Nolan Rucci missed spring ball. Rucci the majority of spring ball, so we didn't see them go head to head at all. We know that Donko won the competition outright last August to earn the starting job. And he was an anchor on that offensive line. Like he was arguably their best offensive lineman up until the point that he got hurt.
Mhm.
And then Rucci comes in, and I think Pro Football Focus, give or take it sometimes, but he was the highest graded offensive lineman in the CFP.
Yeah.
Like Rucci was absolutely stellar for
Unbelievable.
this group.
Yeah.
So you have those two options at right tackle. You've got Drew Shelton over on the left side, for another year. This offensive line is in a really good spot. And just one more note on Tony Rojas in terms of players that there's a lot of confidence around the building. Having a good chat with Dan Connor, the linebackers coach. Quick plug again, for the story I put out earlier this week
Yeah. It was a
on
good one.
Dan Connor and his journey to Penn State.
Mhm.
I had a really good one-on-one chat with him recently, and that story's out there if you want to check it out if you haven't already. But talking to him today and talking to him about Tony Rojas, he was talking about him and Sean Lee and Paul Posluszny and some of the linebackers that he even had on the team before and after. And he was just like, it was a different era of football that we were playing in, and now you got these ultra athletic, intense linebackers that can go sideline to sideline.
Yeah.
And he gave Tony Rojas serious props.
Yeah.
And so I'm intrigued to see how Tony kind of takes that next step, because last year was his first year as a starter. And we also know that he was dealing with an injury down the stretch that ultimately got taken care of in the offseason. And now he's going to be fully good to go for training camp.
Mhm.
So that might have hindered his development a little bit. It was an up and down, I think, first year for him. And he had some big splash plays. He
Mhm.
also had some miscues. And so he's a guy that I'm really looking forward to seeing how he develops. And certainly Penn State is going to need him to be that guy, at linebacker, especially with Kobe King moving on.
Mhm. Yeah. No, absolutely. I like what Tony Rojas can do. I think everybody does. I mean, like you mentioned, the hyper athletic linebackers today, he is to a T that. I mean, the kid could have played college football as a running back, and he's playing linebacker, but certainly has some room to grow. And
He looked like a running back when he had that pick six against SMU.
he really did. That juke right around the 50-yard line was pretty gross. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
We've got a question in the chat that I wanted to hit on real quickly. Thoughts on Jalen Harvey's progression? I mean, obviously, we haven't really seen a whole lot of football yet, but I can tell you the kid looks good physically. And when we talked to him in February, seemed like he had a really good head on his shoulders. The staff is a fan of his to be certain. I do anticipate. I mean, if you project it right now, Johnny, I don't know if you disagree, but I think he's probably number 3 right now.
Yeah.
I mean, he's probably number 3 behind Denai and Fisher. So I think those are all positives for the most part on Jalen Harvey right now. And then Joel also mentioned the CFP uncertainty starting to get annoying. Yeah, I'm with you. I hate that we have so much pandering and just like let's just figure it out. James Franklin has asked about it today. He basically said a lot of nothing to say that he misses the BCS in a roundabout way and believes once again that there should be a commissioner of college football, which I actually do agree with him on that point. But he basically, I think what he was getting at is that he likes how it is right now, and he's more or less against automatic qualifiers until the SEC is playing 9 conference games like everybody else. And then I think he's willing to entertain it a little more. But he said a lot of stuff.
Yeah. It was hard to parse through because I actually transcribed that quote right before we came on the pod, and it is a long quote, and it's kind of hard to decipher a little bit because you're right in that he does say, like, we all have to be playing the same amount of conference games, but he also wants everyone to be in a conference. Cough, cough, Notre Dame, cough, cough. And it's either we're all playing conference championship games or we're not. But he also mentioned in there that, things aren't even right now. And so, if you're trying to choose the 16 best teams and, there's conferences out there that has a greater level of competition week in, week out, why should it be balanced when he was asked specifically about automatic qualifiers? And so it was a little like, he didn't outright agree with Ryan Day, who the other day said, that the Big Ten should have 4 automatic qualifiers if that's the way that a 16-team playoff ultimately goes. There's also the 5-11 model where you have, the 5 highest ranked conference champions plus 11 at-large bids. Either way, like, in terms of, like, I get it as a college football fan being annoyed. I'm sure you're annoyed, like you mentioned. I'm annoyed. Just like it's just a little nauseating, exhausting at the same time. If you're a Penn State fan specifically, and how this matters for Penn State, like the Big Ten getting 4 automatic qualifiers, like I don't know if that's good. I don't see that versus 11 at large. Like if Penn State's 10-2, like they're getting in the playoff. If they're 9-3. Probably, depending on the season, right? It would depend on who they lost to and all that kind of stuff. So I don't think this matters as much for a Penn State. Maybe it matters more for in Illinois, like the season they had last year. A school like that. Maybe even, Ole Miss feels aggrieved even though they shouldn't for the season. But that is a totally different conversation, Max, that we don't have to dive into right now. We already did that.
We did do that already. And if Lane Kiffin wants to make any more fake Twitter accounts, maybe he could complain through that more. If you know. But to move back onto the train tracks after going to the CFP route for a little bit, the last couple bits of newsy-ish topics I think we got to hit on, Johnny, is just the 2 transfers that they brought in the spring window. Trebor Pena and Amare Campbell. They're both on campus. Coaches were able to talk publicly about them for the first time. You chatted with Marcus Hagans and Dan Connor, so you've kind of got the scoop on both those guys there. James Franklin, I thought, had some really intriguing notes about both of those guys. To start with Pena, he said, there's a couple of things. He's a 6th-year guy, which we love. Really interesting quote from him, in my opinion. He brought up how a lot of teams that win the national championship in college basketball are heavily, they've got seniors. Usually the guy bringing the ball up the court is a senior, those kinds of things. And so he says, we love that he was a 6th-year guy. I think that teams with experience are going to thrive in this new CFP era. And I thought that was interesting. He mentioned how Pena was a captain before. He mentioned how, and then I got sidetracked, but with Campbell, he talked about how so many guys that he trusts, were pounding on the table for Campbell. Guys like Mac Brown, his former head coach, Jeff Collins, and Tony Rojas, of course, who is a fellow Virginia native and knows Campbell. And with Pena as well, he said the family was a great fit. There were a lot of, reports out there, some Fran Brown talking about Trebor Pena and basically saying, I think he wanted $2 million, I think was the number that was thrown out there. And James Franklin kind of indirectly said, yeah, that was a lie. Like, we are not he did not say this exactly, but he basically said we're not paying Trebor Pena $2 million. Like he said, all of it was not true. So like obviously they're paying him, but it's not that much money. So it just I thought it was really enlightening on both of those guys. Maybe you can dive a little bit further into what you heard from the position coaches.
Yeah, honestly, the position coaches it was pretty similar to what James said. I asked, not only Marcus Hagan's wide receivers coach, but also Danny O'Brien, the quarterbacks coach, about how Trebor Pena fits in this scheme and what they saw on film that, that they saw him and that they wanted him, right? That he became a priority number one for them out of the portal. And they were just, the first word out of both of their mouths was production. And the fact that Trebor Pena last year, they didn't rattle off the stats, but we know him off the top of our heads at this point after writing about him so much. 84 catches, 941 yards, for that Syracuse team. And so, the route tree was really good. He was in a pass happy offense, so we got a lot of work. And so, yeah, I think that what they saw on tape, they like how he fits in with both Devontae Ross and Kyron Hudson, the other two transfer portal wide receiver additions this offseason. The thing that stood out to me was actually something that James Franklin said, and it was after he was already asked about Pena, and then I followed it up and asked about Amare Campbell, the linebacker from North Carolina that they brought in as well during the spring portal. And something James said, it was, I just want to read it, quote unquote, production versus projection in the transfer portal. He said, in terms of, if you haven't proven it yet at the college level, I'm out of that business. He said, quote unquote, I'm out of that business.
Yeah.
So he doesn't want, like, he's basically done with, hey, this guy who, he was a high 4-star in high school and, a couple of, basically a couple of years at a high profile school and couldn't get it done, but we'll be the team that can bring it out of him. I think he's out on that. Yeah. He needs to see it at the college level. I think about AJ Harris at Georgia, like he was a 5-star and he was there for 1 year and he got playing time, with the Bulldogs on that team. And so that's an example of like, hey, he got on the field. He proved that he could hang. And also he might've been a little bit different in terms of like the projection versus production. But, you look at the production of both of those guys that they got. I already mentioned Pena. Campbell, 10.5 tackles for loss, 6.5 sacks for North Carolina last year. That's production right there. If you're looking for a guy that you need help after losing Tamir Robinson to the portal to USC, you need linebacker help. Dan Connor said that he studied film of 35 to 40 linebackers who were in the portal, and Campbell stood out to him. And then you match it with the production that he already had at a power conference level. Like that's what you're looking for. You're filling holes. You're filling holes with a player or two or three, whatever it may be, that or you feel confident in that can come in and do it. Not like, wow, that guy's really athletic, and I know my assistant coaches are going to be the one that develops him and brings it out of him. Well, that also that kind of formula or philosophy also doesn't really work when you're Penn State this year going into the 2025 season, and you feel like you can win a national championship.
Right.
So I thought it was really interesting what James said, and I'm going to write more about Amare and about Trebor over the next couple of days and what their position coaches said more specifically about their skill set. So I'll save it for that. But it was really good talking to the assistants today and a lot to talk about. New additions, new injury news, both good and bad.
Yeah. Just to kind of wrap up the point on Pena, bit of a sneak peek to something that's coming over the next few weeks for me. I sat down and had a one-on-one with Andy Kotelnicki not too long ago. And I asked him, of course, about this new look wide receiver room. And the first thing he told me was the difference this year is we've seen it on tape. All three of these guys we've brought in have done it on tape. And that gives them confidence, like James said, production over projection, gives them confidence that this year can really be different in the passing game. And off to a good start because the early reviews on Trebor Pena, Kyron Hudson, and Devontae Ross have all been really solid so far. But I think we covered it all, Johnny. It was a big day.
It was. Yeah, it was a big day. Yeah, and I'm bouncing around. I drove up to State College today,
Mhm.
talked to the coaches, turned around, drove back.
Yep.
Not in Philly because my AC unit gave out, and so
Mhm.
been bouncing around to family and friends and all that over there. It gave out on Monday, and it's not going to get fixed until next Tuesday.
Yeah,
So
great timing when it's like our first mini heat wave of the year too.
yeah, when it's in Philly, it's going to be 80. I think it was 87 degrees today. It might even get a little bit warmer over the weekend. So perfect timing. Perfect
Perfect.
timing. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Appreciate all the questions and comments today. We had some good interaction for a unplanned pod. We decided to do this here a little bit late today. So appreciate you all tuning in. If you're watching on the recording, we appreciate you as well. This has been the Blue White Breakdown on Penn Live. Oh, Johnny, you got something else?
Just a quick programming note. I had dropped a line in there earlier in the podcast that Bob is on PTO. So
Ah, yes.
next Monday, it's going to be Max and I.
Mm-hmm.
Next Thursday will be Max and I. Bob is taking his well-earned time off.
That's right.
And so you're going to be seeing these two faces for a little bit if you're watching on YouTube.
Yep.
But Bob will be back. And when Bob is back, I'm taking my PTO. So
Yep.
you're going to see a lot of Max
That's
over
right.
the next month. But looking forward to another pod with you on Monday, buddy.
Yep. Hey, it's what I get for going to Japan for over a week in the spring. So I'm just putting in my time now, and you guys are getting your time off. So
Exactly.
we appreciate everybody tuning in. We'll catch you next time.